Bearing the Unbearable, Love, Loss, and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief, Dr. Joanne Cacciatore writes, "Grief is not a medical disorder to be cured. Grief is not a spiritual crisis to be resolved. Grief is not a social woe to be addressed. Grief is simply a matter of the heart, to be felt." Hi everyone, my name is Kelsey, and I'm a therapist at Sage Therapy Chicago. I am really passionate about serving clients who have experienced loss and supporting them in their individual grief journey. But something I hear a lot from my clients in the first few sessions is a sense of confusion about what it even means to be in therapy for grief and what they hope for us to accomplish together. I hear things like, "I want to start my grief process," or "I've been told that I need to go to therapy to start to feel some of these emotions." And while these are amazing statements, when it comes to getting really specific, I think it's hard to articulate what that means for them or what the purpose of therapy even is in terms of processing your grief, which I think is totally fair. The first and unsatisfying answer is that there really isn't any correct way to grieve, and therefore there isn't any really correct process to go through in grief therapy. Each person is going to approach their loss and their emotions in a way that's unique to them and what they've gone through. So a cookie cutter approach just wouldn't work in grief counseling. But that doesn't mean there isn't any logic or plan. There are actually a lot of really great models and frameworks out there that help therapists think about what a grief process would look like. It might be helpful also when you're thinking about your own grief and what you hope to get out of a therapy experience. So to start off, the theoretical model that is, I feel like, most often talked about in popular culture is, of course, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which was originally detailed in her book on death and dying, published in 1969. Basically, this model details 5 different stages of emotion or reaction to loss, including 1, denial, 2, anger, 3, bargaining, 4, depression, and 5, acceptance. So pretty simple, right? And this model has been referenced and popularized throughout pop culture, even being referenced on shows like Grey's Anatomy. And I think it got so popular because people have been looking for a concrete, tangible example of what a grief process could look like. And this 5 stages seemed to offer it to them. It seemed to show a linear sort of path through one of the worst moments of people's lives. But unfortunately, there have been a lot of misconceptions about this model. First, Kubler-Ross's research was conducted among clients who were terminally ill and facing anticipatory grief in relation to their own passing. And while there may be parallels, it wasn't really meant to necessarily speak to the experience of those who have suffered a loss of someone they loved or a loss in their own lives. And second, there seems to be a common understanding that people are supposed to move sequentially through these stages, and then at one point grief will ultimately be complete when a person reaches acceptance. And Dr. Kubler-Ross has come out and said this was never an original assumption of that work or that research. People can move fluidly in and out of each of these emotions and stages in varying orders. And some people may experience one stage several times, and they might experience another stage not at all. Grief is not really a process that can really be worked through and ever be fully completed, because the fact of the loss doesn't change. Basically, how you cope with the emotions and the grief and the love that comes up as a result of that loss is an ongoing journey that might continue throughout the rest of your life. Now, however, that is not to say that we should be completely throwing out the 5 stages of grief. It's an extremely helpful model for what it was meant to be. And it can give examples of all the ways that grief can show up for us, that it is so much more than simply deep sadness or shock. And in processing grief, this tells both clinicians and clients how important it is to understand, acknowledge, and honor the emotions' individual stages that come up for each of us, without trying to intellectualize them or push them away. Another way of thinking about grief processing is the tasks of grieving, which was developed by Dr. James Worden in the early 1990s. Basically, this model just outlines different tangible and emotional tasks that a person faces when embarking on their grief journey. Task 1 is accepting the reality of the loss, which means adjusting to and facing the feeling of shock or unreality that can often come up following a loss or a death. And it sometimes means creating or participating in rituals, acknowledging the loss, or even just processing the narrative of the loss itself. So attending funerals, attending wakes can be really important as a process, so not always required. Things like just simply telling the story of what happened to trusted people who love and care and can validate the experience can also be a really helpful part of the grieving process. Task 2, which I think is the part that most people equate with therapy, is processing the pain of grief. Basically just allowing yourself to feel all the emotions that come up with that grief. A therapist's job with this task is to create a safe environment which facilitates your ability to feel and tolerate your painful emotions, and maybe learn some coping skills to help ride the wave of those emotions when they do come up throughout day-to-day life. Task 3 is to adjust to a world without the person you've lost. And this might mean on a tangible way, like learning new skills and abilities to take on new responsibilities. It might also just mean adapting to a new identity and a set of beliefs about the world or your role in it or your own spirituality. And finally, task 4 is finding an enduring connection with the person you lost, even amidst embarking on your life. Or basically just finding a way to honor the love you feel and the importance of who or what has been lost. This is kind of the place where a person starts to balance between remembering and living. Similar to the 5 stages of grief, this model helps us understand where a person might be at in their grief and what the task at hand might be in any given session or broader course of therapy. But there is no linear nature to the tasks, and some would argue that they're never fully really complete. However, this model can give you a sense of focus to the work that you're doing, and might give an idea of different categories of discussions that might come up during the course of therapy in a season of grief. Finally, a third model to consider is the dual process model of grief, which is the most complicated of the ones I'm going to talk about today. But it was created by Margaret Stobbe and Hank Schutt in 1995 and addresses a lot of the shortcomings of the other 2 models that we've talked about. Basically, one of the headline options of it is it affirms that sometimes distraction or avoidance of some of the really painful feelings is a necessary part of maintaining a healthy grief process. It also discusses that while the feeling emotional work is really important, the doing instrumental work is just as important. Basically, to put it very, very, very simply, and I'll link more resources below this video, grief processing within this model means moving between 2 very different styles of coping. One, loss-oriented coping, which would be thinking about and focusing on the loss itself and all the emotions associated with it, and then restoration-oriented coping, or focusing on the tasks and adjustments that must be made in order to rebuild a life after you've lost a person you've loved. And both are essential, and people can and should move naturally back and forth between these 2 coping styles in order to ground themselves. Basically, it's okay not to feel all the feelings all of the time. Your job is to respond to your feelings and your needs as they come up, and being mindful to know what those feelings and needs are from any given moment. I'll be honest, that is a lot of academic theory for one day, and a lot of different ways to think about what grief processing can look like when you come to therapy. I also want to mention this is not an exhaustive list. These are some of the older models of therapy that many therapists might be familiar with, but there are consistently new ways of thinking about grief and new research coming out that might be helpful to put even more context behind this that is beyond the scope of what we can just cover in one video. But to sum it up, the focus of grief therapy is not about resolving or forgetting about our grief. It's about learning to live with and tend to the pain of a loss while diminishing any unnecessary suffering. Your grief work should support you in identifying and feeling difficult emotions that may feel intolerable from moment to moment, to help you find and use coping skills that can make riding those waves of grief more bearable. And eventually, when you're ready, to reconnect you with your life so that you continue to grow with the grief. I hope this was even a little bit helpful in giving a little more context into what goes on in grief therapy. And like I mentioned, please feel free to check out the links below for more resources, information on these topics. Take really good care and reach out if you need anything. Thanks.